What if the meaning of life is not something to be discovered at the peak of success, but something that confronts you in the dark, in the silence of a vast estate, in the stillness after the applause fades, in the haunting realization that everything you built might be a beautiful illusion? Lev Tolstoy knew that silence. He heard it echo through the marble halls of aristocratic Russia, in the quiet resentment between lovers, in the eyes of peasants who bowed with respect but never awe. He was not just a novelist, though War and Peace and Anna Karenina etched his name into literary eternity. He was also a seeker, a man who dismantled his own ego piece by piece in pursuit of a terrifying question: why live if life is destined to end in death? It is a question many of us shove aside with busyness, success, or scrolling. But it waits, in the quiet after heartbreak, in the confusion of middle age, in the dread of another work week that feels both urgent and pointless. The question doesn't go away. It simply waits for your attention. And when it demanded Tolstoy's attention, he didn't turn away. He dove into it. Not as a saint, not as a philosopher perched on a podium, but as a broken man trying to survive his own despair. And in that, he becomes not just a figure of history, but a mirror, one that reflects the struggles many of us keep hidden beneath curated lives and clever distractions. Why is this still relevant? Because we are still trying to outrun the void. We chase productivity like a religion. We tell ourselves meaning will come once we've earned enough, done enough, become enough. But meaning doesn't wait at the finish line. It hides in the depths. It lives where few are willing to look. Tolstoy looked. He asked the kind of questions that modern psychology still grapples with. What makes life worth living? Why do people who have it all still suffer? Is happiness found in individual freedom or in service to something greater? These questions are ancient. Echoes of them exist in Stoic philosophy, Buddhist teachings, and the myths of every culture that has tried to make sense of suffering. But Tolstoy's confrontation with these questions happened not in abstraction, but in the midst of wealth, fame, family, and internal ruin. In this video, we will walk through the life of Lev Tolstoy, not just as a literary genius, but as a man undone and remade by existential crisis. We'll explore how his journey mirrors the ones many of us are on today. We will look at what it means to find meaning, not in spite of death, but because of it. This isn't just a history lesson. It's a map, one that might just lead us through our own despair, toward something more solid than happiness, purpose. Before Tolstoy unraveled the meaning of life on a crumpled piece of paper in his study, before he wandered barefoot through the Russian countryside in search of spiritual truth, he lived as a man the world would envy. Count Lev Nikolaevich Tolstoy was born in 1828 into a noble family with land, legacy, and literary promise. He wore the armor of privilege, but something inside him was already cracking. Even in his youth, there were signs: gambling sprees, failed attempts at university, restless travels through Europe. These were not the indulgences of a content soul. They were the actions of someone trying to outrun something unnamed. Like many of us, Tolstoy was busy becoming someone before understanding why. In his early career, he sought meaning through creation. His novels were not just fiction. They were worlds, teeming with philosophy, psychology, and intimate portraits of the human soul. War and Peace was not a book about war, not really. It was about the storm inside people, about love and duty, freedom and fate, about the chaos of history echoing the chaos inside the self. And yet, as Tolstoy approached his 50s, the old answers stopped working. The wealth, the fame, the adoration of intellectuals and aristocrats, it all began to rot in his hands. He described it later as a spiritual death, a creeping sense that life was absurd, that all paths led to the grave, and none of them seemed to mean anything in the end. To understand how revolutionary this was, we must understand the era. In 19th century Russia, the intelligentsia was split between two poles. On one end were the Westernizers, who believed salvation lay in science, rationality, and European ideals of progress. On the other were the Slavophiles, who romanticized the spiritual depth of Russian Orthodox tradition and peasant simplicity. Tolstoy belonged to neither, and yet was haunted by both. He saw the hollowness of European intellectualism, but also the hypocrisy of the Russian Church. Tolstoy's existential crisis was not a private mood. It mirrored a larger cultural rupture. Europe was facing the collapse of traditional religious narratives under the weight of modern science and industrialization. Darwin had already published On the Origin of Species. Nihilism was spreading like a fever in Russia's youth. The old gods were dying, and no new gods had taken their place. This tension wasn't new. It was ancient. Throughout history, humans have tried to grapple with the meaning of life through the lens of philosophy, religion, and art. The ancient Greeks believed in eudaimonia, a flourishing life lived in accordance with virtue. Socrates famously said the unexamined life was not worth living. He meant that meaning arises from knowing oneself deeply, questioning norms, and aligning life with truth. The Stoics, like Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, offered a different but equally resilient approach. For them, life's meaning wasn't found in pleasure or success, but in inner tranquility, virtue, and acceptance of fate. Suffering was not to be escaped, but transformed. In the East, the Buddha confronted suffering directly. His noble truths framed life not as a pursuit of meaning, but as a path of liberation from craving, ego, and illusion. The Taoists dissolved the question itself, urging surrender to the flow of life, not domination over it. And then there was the Christian tradition, where suffering is often seen as redemptive, part of a divine plan that gives even the smallest life cosmic significance. Tolstoy tried all of these. He read the philosophers. He fasted. He flirted with science, orthodoxy, mysticism, even peasant folk wisdom. Nothing stuck. Nothing felt complete. Because the question wasn't academic. It was visceral. He wrote, "My life came to a standstill. I could breathe, eat, drink, sleep, and yet there was no life because there was no wishes the fulfillment of which I could consider reasonable." The terror of that feeling is hard to exaggerate. It is not sadness. It is not depression in the modern clinical sense, though it shares features. It is existential disintegration, a collapse of the story that holds your life together. And yet it is a story that repeats across time. The French philosopher Blaise Pascal felt it when he described the silence of the infinite universe as terrifying. The Islamic mystic Rumi wrote poetry after losing his beloved Shams, collapsing into grief that gave birth to spiritual ecstasy. The Japanese concept of ikigai, a reason for being, was developed in part to help navigate these silent abysses of the soul. These are not abstract philosophies. They are human cries across centuries. And Tolstoy's was one of the loudest. He stopped writing fiction. He renounced his copyrights. He gave up meat, alcohol, tobacco. He tried to give away his land. He dressed in peasant clothes, much to the horror of his aristocratic peers. This was not a PR stunt. It was an unraveling, but also a reconstruction. Because what Tolstoy was beginning to understand was something both terrifying and liberating, that the meaning of life is not given. It must be created, chosen, built, not once, but again and again. In the modern world, we often equate meaning with success or happiness. But Tolstoy discovered something older and deeper, that meaning often arises when we live not for ourselves, but for something larger, whether that is faith, love, community, or a quiet alignment with conscience. This shift from external to internal, from ego to soul, was not just Tolstoy's. It is the same shift that many undergo in midlife, in grief, in failure, in spiritual awakening, So, what changed for Tolstoy? Not the world, not even his circumstances. What changed was the lens. He stopped asking, "What can life give me?" and started asking, "What can I give life?" In doing so, he joined the ranks of those few philosophers, prophets, and mystics who have dared to say, meaning is not out there. It is here, in how we live, in what we serve, in what we're willing to sacrifice. The rest of his life was messy, contradictory, even tragic. But in that mess, he modeled something rare. Not certainty, not perfection, but the courage to rebuild life on something deeper than comfort. And that is where we turn next, to the psychological and emotional architecture of meaning. What does modern science say about what gives our lives depth and direction? How do our minds make sense of suffering, growth, and purpose? And where does Tolstoy's journey overlap with the timeless patterns that define the human soul? Tolstoy's crisis was not just a philosophical problem. It was a psychological one. It was a collapse of internal coherence, of identity, of the narrative that once gave his life shape. And this collapse is not unique to Tolstoy. In many ways, it's a universal threshold, a doorway most of us will encounter, quietly, violently, or repeatedly, throughout our lives. Modern psychology has a name for this process. It's called a midlife crisis, but the phrase is misleading. It doesn't just strike in midlife, and it's not always a crisis in the chaotic sense. Rather, it is a confrontation between the life we have constructed and the deeper needs that construction may have ignored. Carl Jung called it individuation, a lifelong process of becoming who we truly are by integrating the parts of ourselves we often hide or reject. He believed the first half of life is about building the ego, establishing identity, learning to function in society. But the second half? That's where meaning becomes more important than achievement. That's where the soul speaks. And this is exactly where Tolstoy found himself. After decades of constructing the perfect outward life, family, wealth, literary genius, his psyche began to demand something more. Not more stuff, but more truth. In psychological terms, he was moving from extrinsic motivation, driven by status, reward, recognition, to intrinsic motivation, a quieter, deeper compass guided by alignment with values, love, and service. Modern research supports this shift. Psychologist Martin Seligman, one of the founders of positive psychology, identified meaning as one of the 5 core elements of well-being. Alongside pleasure, engagement, relationships, and achievement, meaning stands out as the most elusive, yet most enduring, source of fulfillment. But what creates meaning? Not consumption, not ease. Meaning is constructed through belonging, feeling connected to something greater, family, community, humanity. Purpose, having a direction, a why, even if the how keeps changing. Transcendence, experiences that lift us out of ourselves into awe or sacredness. Storytelling, the ability to make sense of suffering through narrative, to believe that our past has led to something valuable. And here, again, we see Tolstoy's transformation as a case study. He began to find meaning not in being admired, but in being useful. He immersed himself in the lives of Russian peasants, not as a tourist, but as a student. He tried to live a life rooted in simplicity, hard work, moral clarity. He rewrote his story, not as a great man, but as a struggling soul in search of love and truth. This mirrors what Viktor Frankl, the Holocaust survivor and psychiatrist, later described in his seminal work, Man's Search for Meaning. Frankl wrote, "Those who have a why to live can bear almost any how." Frankl's logotherapy posits that meaning is not something we wait for, but something we actively create, especially in suffering. He believed we are not free from pain, but we are free to choose how we respond to it. In that response lies our dignity. Jung, Frankl, Seligman, they all echo what Tolstoy lived. that psychological well-being depends not on removing pain, but on finding a frame that makes the pain meaningful. But there's more, because meaning doesn't live only in the intellect. It lives in the body, in the nervous system, in the habits we repeat and the roles we play. Consider the modern epidemic of burnout, anxiety, and disconnection. On the surface, it looks like overwork or social media addiction, but underneath, it's often a crisis of meaning. We are told to optimize our lives, productivity apps, hustle culture, 5-year plans, but rarely to understand them. We build careers without asking if they nourish us. We stay in relationships out of fear, not love. We scroll to numb, not connect. Psychologist Richard Ryan, co-developer of self-determination theory, identified 3 basic psychological needs: autonomy, competence, and relatedness. When these needs are not met, we suffer, but more importantly, when they are aligned with our actions, we thrive. We find not just pleasure, but meaning. Tolstoy, for all his contradictions, was chasing these exact needs. He wanted autonomy, to choose his life consciously. He needed competence, to feel that his actions were moral, worthy, effective. And he longed for relatedness, not with the elite, but with ordinary people whose lives held a kind of grounded wisdom he felt he had lost. This is why he became obsessed with the gospel, not as a theologian, but as a moral seeker. He was drawn to the Sermon on the Mount, to the simplicity of nonviolence, humility, and unconditional love. These ideas were not abstract to him. They were lifelines. In many ways, Tolstoy was attempting what today we might call spiritual integration, bringing together the parts of ourselves that long for truth, peace, and coherence. He saw the ego for what it was, a mask, and he sought the soul beneath it. This aligns with another psychological framework, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which places self-actualization at the top. But even Maslow revised his model later in life. He realized that beyond self-actualization is self-transcendence, the urge to serve something beyond the self, to lose the ego in devotion to truth, beauty, or the divine. Tolstoy reached for that, not always successfully. He was, after all, still human. He quarreled with his wife, alienated friends, lived in constant tension between desire and duty. But he was reaching for something that all of us, in our quietest moments, long for: to live a life that feels true, to belong to the world in a way that matters. And so, while Tolstoy's context was 19th century Russia, his psychology is deeply modern. He experienced depersonalization, a sense of detachment from self and life, existential anxiety, fear of death, meaninglessness, and spiritual emptiness, identity fragmentation, conflict between the roles he played and the truth he sought, search for coherence, the drive to unify his inner and outer life. These are not rare experiences. They are human ones. They emerge in transitions, losses, awakenings. They show up when the map stops matching the territory, when the story of who we are starts to crack and something deeper begins to speak. So what do we do with this? We listen, not just to Tolstoy, but to the parts of ourselves we silence. The ones that whisper, "This isn't it." The ones that ask, "What am I really living for?" The ones that long not for a bigger life, but a more meaningful one. And from there, we begin. Slowly, imperfectly, but honestly. Because the meaning of life, as Tolstoy came to see, is not a sentence we memorize. It's a path we walk, a way of being, a kind of love, a commitment to truth, no matter how uncomfortable. Next, we will explore what happens when we ignore this path, when we live by the world's expectations instead of our own conscience. What are the consequences of living without meaning, and how have others across history, mythic and modern, paid the price for that disconnection? When Lev Tolstoy stood at the edge of his own despair, he was staring into a truth that most people spend their lives trying to avoid. that we can build everything the world tells us to build: status, comfort, acclaim, and still feel empty. That we can play every role perfectly and still lie awake at night wondering, is this all there is? The consequences of living without meaning are not always loud. They rarely begin with dramatic breakdowns. Instead, they begin quietly, in the slow erosion of joy, in the dull ache that follows success, in the subtle numbness that creeps into ordinary moments. Psychologically, this is often misdiagnosed as burnout, depression, or anxiety. And while those labels are valid and important, underneath them often lies something even deeper: the pain of misalignment. Misalignment between who we are and how we live, between the values we speak and the choices we make, between the soul's longing and the ego's performance. Tolstoy wrote about this with searing honesty. He described moments where he could no longer ride horses or hold a hunting rifle without feeling disgusted with himself, where conversations with friends felt hollow, and the very words he once wrote with pride now struck him as fraudulent. He wasn't just tired, he was fractured. This fracture, the split between our inner and outer lives, is one of the most devastating human experiences. And yet, it is also one of the most common. Today, we see it everywhere. The high-achieving executive who dreads Mondays, the influencer with millions of followers and no real connection, the parent who loves their children but wonders what became of their own dreams, the student who gets top grades but feels like a ghost in their own skin. These are not failures of willpower. They are cries for meaning, for depth, for authenticity. When these cries go unanswered, the consequences ripple outward. 1. Identity confusion. When we live by external scripts, we lose sight of our inner compass. We begin to confuse achievement with identity, praise with worth, productivity with purpose. Over time, this creates what psychologists call role engulfment, when we become the roles we play, forgetting that we are more than any of them. 2. Disconnection from others. Tolstoy felt this keenly. The more he questioned the foundation of his life, the more estranged he became from his peers, even his wife. He wrote about the unbearable loneliness of not being understood, of speaking a truth that others didn't want to hear, and this is still true today. When we begin to seek meaning in a world obsessed with metrics, it can feel like exile. 3. Emotional flatness. Living without meaning often leads to what existential psychologists call anomie, a state of moral and emotional disorientation. It's not depression in the clinical sense. It's a subtler kind of emptiness, a sense that nothing really matters and that even pleasure is just distraction. 4. Escapism and addiction. In the absence of meaning, we reach for stimulation. We scroll, binge, shop, drink, overwork, not because we are weak, but because we are hungry. Hungry for presence. Hungry for connection. Hungry for a life that feels like ours. Tolstoy wrote about this hunger too, though in different terms. He saw how people numbed their existential pain with alcohol, entertainment, and cruelty. 5. Ethical compromise. Perhaps most dangerously, a life without meaning is vulnerable to moral drift. When we do not know why we live, we become susceptible to any system that offers a ready-made answer, no matter how empty or destructive. History is filled with examples: totalitarian regimes that gave people identity through ideology, cults that preyed on spiritual longing, corporate machines that equate human value with output. Tolstoy saw this in the Russian aristocracy, a class so removed from spiritual life that they built their identities on hierarchy, consumption, and violence. He was not just critiquing a political system. He was mourning a human tragedy, the loss of moral clarity in the absence of existential depth. And yet, there is a strange paradox here, because the very pain of meaninglessness can also become the doorway to awakening. Just as a fever is the body's way of signaling infection, despair is often the soul's way of demanding attention. It's a rebellion against a life that is too small, too shallow, too performative. In this sense, Tolstoy's crisis was not the end of his life, but the beginning of his real one. He began to rebuild not from the outside in, but from the inside out. Slowly, painfully, authentically, he stripped away illusions. He renounced his copyrights. He gave up luxuries. He wrote not to impress, but to serve. His book, The Kingdom of God is Within You, became a call to conscience, a plea for nonviolence, love, and radical moral integrity. It would go on to influence Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr., but more importantly, it gave him peace, not the peace of perfection, but the peace of alignment. Because the consequences of finding meaning are just as powerful as the consequences of lacking it. They include inner coherence, the feeling that your life tells a consistent story, that your choices reflect your values, that your soul and your schedule are on speaking terms. Emotional resilience. Meaning doesn't make suffering disappear, but it gives you a reason to endure, a reason to grow through it rather than collapse under it. Authentic connection. When you live from truth, you attract truth. Conversations deepen. Relationships become less performative. Love becomes more possible. Moral clarity. You stop asking, "What will they think of me?" and start asking, "What do I think of this?" You become less manipulable, more grounded, more sovereign. Legacy beyond ego. You begin to think not just in terms of success, but impact. Not just what you leave behind, but what you plant in others. Tolstoy, by the end of his life, did not find all the answers, but he found a path that embraced imperfection, humility, and continual return to what matters. In his final days, he fled his estate seeking simplicity, clarity, and solitude. He died at a small railway station surrounded not by royalty or scholars, but by silence. And yet, even in that lonely end, there was a strange kind of beauty. He had followed the call of his conscience, even when it cost him everything, because a meaningful life is rarely a comfortable one, but it is always a true one. So the question is no longer what is the meaning of life, as if it were a riddle to solve. The real question is, what is the cost of not looking for it? And even more, what might become possible if we do? There is a moment in many of our lives when we realize we have been living someone else's story. Not because we are weak, not because we're naive, but because we have been taught from the beginning how to survive, not how to ask what makes life worth surviving for. Tolstoy was nearly 50 when that moment arrived for him. Up to that point, he was everything society told him he should be: famous, wealthy, successful, admired. But inside, he felt like a fraud. His words rang hollow. His accomplishments tasted of ash. He once described it as being a man who had climbed to the top of a ladder, only to discover it was leaning against the wrong wall. This is not just the story of a 19th-century Russian aristocrat. It's the quiet despair of the high-functioning modern adult, the parent who wonders who they are beyond their role, the professional who hits every target and still feels numb, the artist who creates for applause instead of truth, the student who is terrified of choosing the wrong path because none of them feel like home. There is no single name for this moment. Some call it burnout. Others call it an existential crisis. In psychological terms, it can be related to what Carl Jung called the midlife individuation process, the point where our outer persona, the mask, starts to crumble, and our inner self demands to be heard. But Tolstoy called it by its oldest name, the search for meaning. And meaning, he discovered, is never inherited. It must be made. The weight of the script. Most of us live by scripts we didn't write. They are handed down from parents, culture, religion, school, media. They tell us what success looks like, what love is supposed to feel like, who we're allowed to be. For a while, these scripts work. They keep us safe. They help us belong. But eventually, the cost of staying on script becomes unbearable. We start to feel like actors in our own lives, smiling on cue, performing approval, suppressing the parts of ourselves that don't fit the role. And then, if we are lucky or brave, we begin to unravel. This unraveling is not a breakdown. It's a breakthrough, a dismantling of what is false so that what is true can finally rise. The wilderness of not knowing. When Tolstoy abandoned his old beliefs, he did not instantly replace them with new ones. He wandered. He doubted. He wrestled with nihilism, flirted with asceticism, and wept through uncertainty. This part is crucial, because our culture tends to skip it. We love the before and after story, the tidy arc, the TED Talk with a moral. But real transformation rarely looks like that. It's messy, it's slow. It often involves walking through long stretches of confusion, where nothing feels solid and everything feels at risk. But that is where meaning is forged, in the wilderness. Psychologist James Hollis writes that every major transition in life comes with a sacred question. What wants to emerge in me now? Not, what do people expect of me? Not, what will make me look successful? But, what is aching to come alive in me, even if it breaks the script? The power of sacred disobedience. Tolstoy did something radical. He stopped pretending. He stepped out of his expected role. He rejected the systems that once gave him prestige. He let go of admiration in favor of alignment, and in doing so, he gave himself back to himself. This is sacred disobedience, not rebellion for its own sake, but the refusal to betray the soul for the sake of fitting in. You do not have to renounce your wealth or leave your family to walk this path. You simply have to begin telling the truth about your life. Ask, where am I saying yes when my body says no? What part of me is starving for attention? What am I pretending not to know? These questions can feel dangerous, but they are the beginning of freedom. The gentle revolution. There is an old Zen saying, before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. Tolstoy did not escape life. He returned to it, with new eyes. He worked in the fields. He wrote simpler truths. He raised his children. He prayed. He suffered. He grew. This is the gentle revolution that meaning creates. Not a life of drama, but a life of depth, where even the ordinary becomes sacred, where presence replaces performance, where silence speaks louder than applause. You may not change your entire life overnight. You may still have bills to pay, people to care for, systems to navigate. But you can begin changing the way you live, with presence, with honesty, with intention. Wake up 5 minutes early to be with yourself before the world arrives. Say one true thing in a conversation today, even if it makes you nervous. Choose to rest when your old self would have pushed. Forgive a past version of you who did not yet know how to choose differently. These small acts are not trivial. They are seeds, and over time, they bloom into lives of deep, grounded meaning. Closing reflection. There is no formula for a meaningful life, only a process, a willingness to listen, a courage to change, a softness to receive what is already within you. Lev Tolstoy did not figure it out. He simply allowed himself to begin again, not once, but many times. And so can you, because maybe the meaning of life is not found in answers, but in how honestly we live the questions. Maybe it's not about being extraordinary, but about being fully, fiercely human. Maybe it's about writing your own script, not perfectly, but truthfully. And maybe, just maybe, it starts today. If meaninglessness is a kind of silent erosion, slow, invisible, yet deeply corrosive, then meaning must be built with care, like a shelter against the winds of time. Lev Tolstoy did not discover the meaning of life like a man stumbles upon treasure. He crafted it, piece by piece, through questions, sacrifices, and radical honesty. He turned away from noise and prestige and turned inward. What he found there was not perfection. It was practice. And that is where we begin, too, with small, deliberate practices that reconnect us to what is real. Because in a world of distraction, meaning is an act of attention. 1. Pause and ask the difficult questions. Tolstoy began his transformation by asking himself terrifying, unavoidable questions. Why am I living? What will remain when I die? What do I believe in? Not intellectually, but with my whole being. We rarely ask ourselves these questions unless we are forced to. And yet, they are the ones that shape everything. Careers, relationships, identity, they are all downstream of meaning. You do not need to answer them all at once, but you do need to ask, and then listen. Journal. Walk. Be still. Let the discomfort rise, because discomfort is often the sign that something real is stirring. Try this journal prompt. If I stripped away everything that makes me impressive, what would be left? Is that enough for me? 2. Reclaim inner authority. Tolstoy realized that he had been living by inherited scripts, the church's doctrine, the aristocracy's values, the writer's ego. Only when he questioned those did he begin to live truthfully. Modern psychology speaks of this too. Internal family systems, IFS, for example, teaches that we all have inner parts shaped by childhood, trauma, and society. Some of these parts chase success to feel worthy. Others avoid intimacy to feel safe. Reclaiming meaning means understanding which parts are running your life and then inviting yourself back into leadership. You can do this by practicing inner witnessing. Pause during your day and ask, whose voice is this? Is this action aligned with my deepest values or just with survival? Am I choosing or am I performing? Over time, these small check-ins return you to your own center, and meaning always begins there. 3. Connect to something larger than the self. When Tolstoy renounced his wealth, it was not out of self-hatred, it was out of service. He had seen that the ego is never satisfied, but meaning, he wrote, comes from serving something greater: truth, love, justice, God. Whether you are religious, spiritual, or secular, this holds true. Modern research backs this up. Psychologist Emily Esfahani-Smith identified 4 pillars of a meaningful life: belonging, purpose, storytelling, and transcendence. Each one involves stepping outside the narrow confines of the self. Belonging, authentic connection with others. Purpose, contributing to something beyond you. Storytelling, making sense of your life experiences. Transcendence, moments of awe, prayer, creativity, or nature. You can cultivate these through simple rituals, volunteer, or help someone without expecting anything back. Reflect on your life story. What events shaped you and why? Spend time in nature and let yourself feel small in a beautiful way. Pray, meditate, or simply sit in silence and listen. 4. Embrace simplicity. Tolstoy's later life was a rejection of luxury. He dressed plainly, ate simply, worked with peasants in the fields. This was not performative. It was a spiritual discipline. In modern terms, this is intentional living, the practice of stripping life down to what truly matters. Try this. Clean your physical space with reverence. Audit your time. What drains you? What restores you? Limit consumption. Not just material, but digital. Every input is shaping your sense of meaning. Ask often, is this adding depth to my life or just noise? 5. Reframe suffering as transformation. Tolstoy wrote that his deepest despair eventually became the soil of his awakening. This echoes countless spiritual and psychological traditions. Suffering, when faced directly, becomes a teacher. Viktor Frankl, The Holocaust survivor and psychologist wrote in Man's Search for Meaning that people can endure unimaginable pain if they believe there is purpose in it. Meaning does not erase suffering, but it redeems it. It turns wounds into wisdom, loss into perspective, darkness into depth. So instead of resisting pain, ask, what is this teaching me? What part of me is dying? And what might be born in its place? Can I let this moment deepen me rather than destroy me? In Tolstoy's words, the darker the night, the brighter the stars. Yix, build a life that tells the truth. The ultimate practice is not abstract, it is architectural. Build your life brick by brick to reflect your values. This means choosing work that nourishes you, even if it pays less. It means nurturing relationships that challenge you to grow, not just ones that flatter you. It means creating art, writing, movement, or conversation that feels honest, not optimized for applause. This takes time, patience, courage, but it is worth everything, because in the end, meaning is not something we find. It is something we build by the way we live. Try this thought experiment. Imagine your 85-year-old self watching your current life like a film. What would make them proud? What would make them weep? Then adjust accordingly. Yevon. Practice micro-actions of meaning. Daily meaning can be large and existential, but it is also small and immediate. Make your morning coffee with attention. Write a letter to someone who changed you. Speak the truth, even when it's awkward. Choose depth over speed in conversation. Read slowly, walk barefoot, laugh loudly. These are not distractions. They are the practice. Meaning is not found in grand theories. It is made in how you touch the world and how you let it touch you. Lev Tolstoy's life was not clean, easy, or perfect, but it was true. And that truth came not from a single revelation, but from thousands of quiet decisions to live with soul. So we do the same, not by imitating him, but by listening to what his story awakens in us. The longing for something real, the desire to feel alive, the courage to begin again. Not someday, but now. By the time Tolstoy died, he had become a myth, an icon of moral struggle, spiritual rebellion, and intellectual clarity. But it is easy to forget that he did not set out to be any of those things. He was a man in pain. A man who woke up one morning with everything he had ever wanted and realized that none of it made sense anymore. And in that disillusionment, he asked the question that echoes across every human life, regardless of time, status, or belief. What is this all for? It is a question that humbles kings and confuses children, a question that rises in the silence of late nights and the quiet of long walks, a question that does not care about our accomplishments, only our alignment. We often imagine the meaning of life as something far away, an answer at the top of a mountain, a sentence written in a sacred book, a truth whispered by saints. But meaning, Tolstoy discovered, is not hidden in clouds or temples. It is embedded in the very act of living consciously, in choosing love over ego, truth over comfort, stillness over noise, depth over display. He came to see that the real tragedy of life is not death, it is living without ever asking why. He believed that many people live as though they were asleep, performing roles handed to them by culture or family, never questioning whether those roles reflect who they really are. And this is where his story touches ours. Because in a world more distracted, more performative, and more fragmented than ever, the danger is not that we will make the wrong choices. It is that we will make unconscious ones, that we will drift, that we will forget we are allowed, required even, to stop, reflect, and begin again. Tolstoy's journey is not a blueprint. It is not about giving up wealth or writing religious tracts or abandoning the world. It is about courage, the courage to confront the void, to step away from false safety, to live a life where your soul is part of the conversation. Because the meaning of life is not a destination, it is a dialogue, a living relationship with your values, your vulnerabilities, and your vision. Sometimes that meaning is found in books and philosophy. Other times in folding laundry, in holding someone's hand, in watching light spill across the floor. It is found when your actions are in harmony with your truth, even if no one sees it but you. This kind of life does not guarantee comfort, but it does bring peace, the quiet, grounded peace that comes from knowing you are not betraying yourself. And perhaps that is the ultimate legacy of Lev Tolstoy. Not the novels, not the fame, not even the crisis, but the reminder that it is never too late to begin again, that at any moment you can stop performing, stop running, stop pretending, and ask, what matters most? What do I believe, deep down, beyond fear, and how can I live as if that were true? Because you are not here to play someone else's script. You are not here to chase hollow victories or polish empty masks. You are here to become you, with depth, with clarity, with meaning. And that is not an answer. That is a practice. One breath at a time. One choice at a time. One true word at a time. So the next time life feels flat, or success tastes like ash, or silence becomes unbearable, remember this: it is not a failure. It is an invitation to turn inward, to listen, to live, just like Tolstoy did, just like you still can. If something in this story stirred you, pause for a moment, not to rush to the next video, not to scroll away, but to breathe, to let it land. Because what you just witnessed is not just the story of Lev Tolstoy, it is the story of all of us, searching for meaning in a world that rarely teaches us how to find it. We live in a time of constant noise, fast answers, and shallow solutions. But this space, this channel, is something different. Here, we go deep. We ask the hard questions. We look to the past to understand the present. We blend ancient wisdom with modern psychology. And we speak to the part of you that is tired of pretending and ready to grow, with purpose, honesty, and power. If you're someone who feels things deeply, who wants more than just hacks and headlines, who senses that life must be more than the roles we play or the success we chase, then you are not alone, and you are exactly where you need to be. We explore what it means to live with intention, to reclaim your voice, to build emotional intelligence, self-awareness, and a sense of direction that is rooted in something real. Every story here, whether it's about Tolstoy, Jung, Frida Kahlo, or forgotten queens of history, is really about you, your fears, your gifts, your longing to live a life that reflects who you truly are. So if you're ready for that journey, subscribe. Not because it helps the algorithm, but because it means something. It means you're choosing a space where growth is sacred, where your mind is respected, and where your soul is a part of the conversation. We're building a community of seekers, thinkers, feelers, and builders. And you belong here. Let's keep asking better questions. Let's keep finding deeper answers. And most of all, let's keep waking up. This is just the beginning.